I want to start with St. Helena Island. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may be, this is the first time. St. Helena Island has a specific location in the world. It's in the Atlantic Ocean, about halfway across it. It's right in the middle between Rio de Janeiro and Namibia in southwestern Africa. You might know its historical significance in that it's the place where Napoleon was exiled after his final defeat in Europe. This is where he spent the remainder of his life. And a few days ago, I realized the importance of this place to me in my life, even though I've never been there before. And it has a lot to do with what happened while Napoleon lived there. You see, Napoleon, late in his life, had visitors on this island. And one such visitor wrote down their conversations. And after Napoleon died, he published it into a bestseller in France. I mean, what an opportunistic guy. But when you think about what he wrote, there was one particular idea that was infamous. And this was the idea that Napoleon had about history. The exchange goes something like this. At the time of the events, during the heat of conflicting passions, history cannot exist. At a later period, all parties are agreed respecting it. So then what is the truth of history? That it is a fable agreed upon. I've heard this lesson before. In fact, when I was young, younger than you, I spent my summers in southeastern Kansas, which is also kind of like being on the edge of the world. There's nothing out there. But that's where my family came from originally. And I heard Napoleon through the lens of my great-aunt Julia, a fiercely independent, fiery woman with a mind like a diamond, ferocious reader. And she always said, "Luke, history is an agreed-upon pack of lies." That's what Napoleon said. I didn't really get that until later on as a teacher, and it becomes my life. And that's the thing. The notion of agreement is what stuck out in my mind connected to this. Agreement implies intention. Agreement implies distortion. So if we were truly studying history, it occurred to me pretty quick that it didn't matter what history I was studying. It didn't really matter why I was studying history either. What mattered was how I thought about history. And so that's going to be the subject of my talk today. It's historical thinking. I'm going to talk about it as a necessary but unnatural act. And I'll unpack what I mean by that. So when I'm not in a history classroom, I'm a psychology teacher too. When we seek to understand, we always start with what we know, and that's ourselves. The basic principles of psychology tell us that, to an extent, when we want to claim what it is that we know, what knowledge we have, our understanding of the world, we look inside of ourselves. We look to our memories. We consider what emotions we have at that time. We consider what sort of beliefs and traditions have been ingrained in our mind. And then we speak with the authority of what we know. Well, the intriguing thing about what we know is it's a bit problematic. Because unless you take the active step to critically assess and think about what it is that you know, I'm talking about metacognition, you might end up in a pattern where you think the world just revolves around you and your thoughts. History can help us understand this. So here's how I would define history. History is not the past. Spoiler alert. History is, in fact, a debate about the past. And it's that last word in there that sets me apart from Napoleon. Whereas he said it's an agreement, I'm in total disagreement with that. But what is the importance of this debate? Why do I bring it up? Are we meant to learn history, to debate its contents for the sake of writing really stellar essays? Are we meant to learn and debate history from the standpoint of, oh, if I'm assigned the affirmative position, I can crush the dissent? I don't think so. In the pursuit of historical truth, we happen upon a path that leads us outward. Historical truth teaches us to grow. Early on in my college career, I happened across a definition offered up by Latin, actually. The original word for history, its Latin derivation, means to lead outward. It's kind of a novel concept when you think about it. You were asked as students, and all of us have been asked at some point in our life when learning, to consider many different fields. But the fact that there's one entirely devoted to moving away from the confines of what you know, what's inside, and instead trying to apply yourself to thinking that goes beyond the confines of your mind. What I'm talking about here is history is, in effect, a process of empathy. So let's think about empathy for a second. There's an age-old tradition to teach the notion of empathy, and that means, oh, you should think about things, you should understand things from the shoes of another person. It's an approachable thing to illustrate empathy that way, but it's a rather ambitious prospect. If the nature of your knowledge is everything inside of you, then to suggest that you need to remove yourself entirely from what you believe and think, and almost quite literally stand in the shoes of another person and try and attempt their understanding, that's really unnatural. That's really difficult to do. It's easier said than done. So, in comes that debate again. The debate means you have to think about things not just from your vantage point, but others as well. But here's the thing about the debate. It's an ongoing thing, but it's really lacking in participation, despite how important it is. I would argue that taking part in this debate is something that encourages you to grow, to think about how you might approach the world differently. So let's enter into a particular debate, shall we? I'm going to share with you a quote from history. And the quote that I'm going to share, projected up on the board, we'll talk about who its author is and meanings behind it in a moment. But as I read it, I want you to think about who could potentially have said this. I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races. There is a physical difference between the two, which in my judgment will probably forever forbid their living together in perfect equality. Powerful statement. We're talking about race, we're talking about social justice, we're talking about equality, and we're talking about somebody who has a very strict opinion on prejudice. Let me give you a few hints. See if you can figure it out. First, the speaker is male. The speaker is American. And the speaker is a president. Anyone got anyone in mind? Not quite. Abraham Lincoln. Now hang on a second. Abraham Lincoln, we're talking about the guy known as the Great Emancipator. The guy known for ending slavery. Clearly we have some kind of conflict going on here. If you stop and think about what's going on in your head, it might lead you to a series of questions. Gosh, what do I know about Abraham Lincoln? What do I know about his life? What do I know about the time that he came from? And by extension, well, what do I know about race? What do I know about racism, prejudice? What do I think? What are my opinions on that? When you seek to understand, you look inward first. Well, in order to truly give this the best possible information and the best credence that we can to these words to try and understand how they happened, we have to ask a really difficult question. Was Abraham Lincoln a racist? So, to answer that question, let's dig in. So, we've got a lot going on up here. Let's talk about it. Across the top of my slide represents actions, thoughts, writings, moments from Lincoln's life. If we're truly going to understand the thoughts and deeds of someone, we have to look at what they did. We have historical documentation of all these things. In the far corner, we have letters written from early on in his life before he got into politics. In 1858, we have a discussion that happened on a political trail, which is where our quote originally comes from. But 5 years removed from the quote, Lincoln's president, and Lincoln, with the stroke of a pen, is changing the lives of millions of non-white Americans, granting them freedom for the first time in their lives. Across the bottom, the context of Lincoln's world. If we're going to talk about standing in the shoes of another person and truly understanding empathy, we have to understand where those shoes were located. So, first of all, 1858. Well, as I stated before, he's on the campaign trail. This happened during a series of senatorial debates that happened in the state of Illinois. Before Lincoln was president, he attempted to become a senator. He ultimately didn't win that election. But while he was on the campaign trail, his opponent, a guy named Stephen Douglas, he and Lincoln entered into what are now a famous series of debates known as the Lincoln-Douglas debate. During this time, Stephen Douglas was a fierce speaker, an absolute titan of speaking. And when he was out there talking, he was primarily talking about white superiority and how folks who weren't white didn't really have many rights and didn't deserve them. And he often characterized Lincoln as the polar opposite of him, suggesting that Lincoln cared too much, perhaps, about black people. And yet, think back to our quote. Lincoln, in his response, would say, no to political and social equality for people who are not white. He would say that there's a physical difference between them and that equality is a dream, that it would never happen. Did he say it because he's out on the campaign trail, speaking to a largely white audience of voters, trying to win the vote? Well, let's add on to that quote. You have to think about other things he said too. Further on in that speech, Lincoln in his remarks suggested that a black man was not his equal in terms of morality and intellect. So not only is there a physical disparity, but he's never going to be as smart as me, and he'll never be as good as me. Powerful words coming from Lincoln. But we take this with a grain of salt, because by the end of his assertion, he does state, however, that blacks and whites deserve equal entitlement to things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So his comments are cryptic. Is he racist or not? Thinking about what he said, it's hard to say. But what is only one moment in time? Let's go back to 1841. Lincoln's a younger man. He's traveling through his home state of Kentucky. And while he's traveling, he's riding on a boat. And while he's on this boat, he's writing a letter to one of his best friends, a woman named Mary Speed. While he was on the boat, Abraham Lincoln encountered a collection of recently purchased slaves. They were all chained together and hanging out on the deck. They were en route to a plantation where they would live out the rest of their lives as slaves. Lincoln sat there and talked about the harsh reality, in his letter the harsh reality of what would face them in their lives of slavery. But then he also made sure to note that they were sitting there telling stories, they were playing games, they were laughing. And he uttered this really infamous line. He said, "How true is it that God renders the worst of human conditions tolerable?" Worst of human conditions. Clearly that's slavery. Worst implies some kind of negative thought about it. But tolerable? We're going to tolerate it? No clear answer there either. If we think about the world in which Lincoln lived, stop me if this sounds familiar. He's standing in a society that is rigidly divided on the notion of civil rights, on the notions of race, who deserves what, and both sides are fervently involved in arguing against one another. They truly believe what they say. It's relevant to modern times in some cases. The pro-slavery folks, considering our picture to the left, they believed that the physical difference was a real thing, that a person who was white was not the same species as a person who was not white. And they also argued that, hey, we can invoke religion and use religion as a tool for saying that we're right. A famous quote that was published in a book lauding the praises of slavery said that God hath made us, white people, to rule and the Negro to serve. They fervently believed it. But as much passion as there was for slavery on the opposite side, Frederick Douglass, in a photo campaign right around the time of emancipation, 1863, published a series of photos in which he tried to educate the American society at that time on what slavery was about and why it was wrong and how good emancipation was. The photos to the bottom right are from those picture exhibits in 1863. They're photos of slaves, or recently emancipated slaves, I should say. I'm not talking about the two black gentlemen in those photos. The white children, or the children who appear white, were also slaves. If that doesn't jive with you, if that doesn't make a great deal of sense, it pulls back the veil and reveals what they meant by physical difference. There was this harsh social rule and understanding known as the one-drop rule. The idea that if you had a non-white relative in your immediate or extended family, that you had, in theory, one drop of non-white blood in your blood, and therefore, you were not white. And as a result, you could be a slave. Was Lincoln a racist? It's a heck of a debate to enter into. We've looked at all this evidence, we've analyzed it, we've talked about context. We're really making an effort to think from the vantage point of Lincoln's life at that time and the actions and ideas that he presented. Can I say right now, here in front of you, with absolute certainty, that Lincoln was racist? The answer is, no, I can't. I don't know the answer. But that's the thing about history. It doesn't matter what you learn, it doesn't matter why you're learning it. What matters is how you think about it. Even though I don't have an answer for you, the idea is the process that got us here is what matters. That's what's most important. Think about it for a second. In the moments that we've been talking about this, we challenged your preconceived notions about what you might have understood about this topic before. We got in depth. We wrestled with a lot of different information and tried to make sense of it to answer a divisive question. And in the process, it led you to a deeper understanding, not just of Lincoln, but of a lot of things. That's an important lesson. More to the point, we were able to talk about Lincoln as a human. Yesterday, or even 15 minutes ago, if I asked you who Lincoln was, you probably would have thought, oh, you know, he's a part of that narrative that ended slavery. He didn't like it. End of story. Squeaky clean. By talking about history in this sense and really digging in and trying to consider what's out there versus what we know, we humanize individuals like Lincoln. We show his hubris, his flaws. And as a result, it doesn't just teach you history. It teaches you something about what you think. It teaches you a larger lesson. So, here's the thing about this. And I find myself back again at St. Helena Island, kind of reflecting on where I have always been when it comes to thinking about history. Doesn't matter what I learn, doesn't matter why I learn it, matters is how I think about it. History is a debate, one that demands your participation. In a world where information is at your fingertips, in a matter of seconds you can Google anything and have an answer. But at what cost does that come? Easy information raises serious concerns for me about literacy and our ability to critically assess what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. So the importance of an unnatural act of taking on empathy and trying to think beyond the confines of what we know and believe, that's the importance of thinking about history. I would say that's something the world needs more of. And in all honesty, how else can we expect to grow if not by looking beyond the obvious? Thank you very much.